Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, which is one of our regular Tuesday webinars, where we cover a wide area of interests around different issues and different subjects. Now, one of the things we've been looking at recently is abuse on the internet. And we had an informal discussion evening about that a week or so ago. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting in the House of Commons that was packed out, which was hosted by Jess Phillips, and which looked at abuse on the internet and its impact on the quality of our democracy. If MPs are abused, does it change how democracy functions and the quality of it? And that was a very interesting meeting, and we had a lot of students there from universities, which was really, really interesting. Now, clearly, one of the issues is when you do have abuse, there is sort of a clamour for doing something about it. Do we censor? What do we do? And that raises the question of free speech versus dealing with abuse. The whole movement of net neutrality, for example, is about the net being available for everyone on an equal playing field. You don't get access because you have more power or more money. It's there for everyone. On the other hand, abuse does affect the quality of life, and it affects people. And we have to ask whether our libel laws and our laws of defamation are sufficient to deal with that. Anyhow, Digby Tantam is here with us today, and you can see him here, and I'm just going to go to him in a sec, and he will do a presentation and then answer questions from you. And you can type up your questions as he speaks. You don't have to wait till he finishes in the chat box on the right-hand side. The webinar will be recorded, and then we will disseminate it and send it out to as many people as possible. Anyhow, thank you for doing this, Digby, and I'm going to hand over to you now to give your presentation.
Okay, Francis, well, thank you for inviting me. Just to say a little bit about myself, I'm a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a psychotherapist and a human being, I hope, as a result of all those things. I've been following the whole Brexit situation partly through my wife, Emmy van Derzen's experiences, and partly, of course, through following the news. I'm very disturbed by the government's attitude and the lack of sensitivity to almost all the parties involved, except for those people who are determinately Brexiteers. But I know tonight I've been asked to talk about the impact of the trolling and the intimidation that seems to be occurring in some sectors of the internet. And Francis has broadened that out to talking more widely about freedom of speech. So I prepared a few PowerPoints, and I'll give my views about that. They're principally based on, of course, my own experience of using the internet, but also of my research into bullying, especially of people with autism, and a wider interest that's followed from that in bullying. But I'm going to make a slight distinction tonight between what's now called trolling and bullying. So I'm going to talk a bit about both of those. So this is the title that this webinar is advertised under. And I want to say, first of all, that I don't believe in free speech. In other words, I don't think any of us ever speak completely freely. We have to take account, we do typically take account of what the impact of our speech will be on other people. And that's just a part of normal socialization, a very important part of normal socialization. I'm a group therapist also, and there's a kind of convention in a group. You say to people, just say whatever you want. But everybody knows that actually, if you said whatever you wanted, you could say very antisocial or strange or abrupt or rude things. So there is a kind of tension between people being self-disclosing, which is one of the things that you hope people will do, but being also sticking to basic social conventions, I suppose you could say, about being sensitive to other people's feelings and sometimes their ability to understand what you're saying. Of course, the idea there should be free speech is a very deeply held one. This is what is contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed just after the war, in the Second World War, in the context of horror at the suppression of free speech and the suppression of freedom that the war brought forward. The idea that one person could humiliate, tyrannize, and another person, not just one-on-one, but a massive group being treated in that way, produced a tremendous reaction and a view that that would never happen again. So the idea of free speech is a wonderful cry of liberation in a way, and we would all in some way wish that it was still true. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And of course, that, in a way, that promise has only really come true now we have the internet. Because despite, well, for a while, governments weren't even trying to create frontiers. Of course, now they are in the internet. But even now, despite the efforts of the Iranians and the Chinese and to put barriers up, those barriers are partly ineffective. So there still is a degree of freedom of speech. But of course, we've never really believed that speech, as I say, could be entirely free. Here, a very interesting list of exemptions to that idea that we can just speak freely that Wikipedia has on its pages. So we've never believed that it's right to libel people or to slander people. There have been strong controls against obscenity. For a long while, stage plays in the UK had to be put through the Lord Chancellor's office, who would decide whether or not they should be performed. I think that dates back to the 17th century. Before that, no, probably earlier, probably to Elizabethan times. So, and the Lord Chancellor would not just look at issues like obscenity or pornography, but issues about sedition or incitement, words that incite riot or create fights, speech that reveals classified information that governments feel is dangerous to disseminate, might even identify agents in the field who might be killed or in some way attacked. Copyright violation, all authors have experience of having their books translated in other countries and circulated. Not only is this a loss of copyright income, but also it may be that the texts are corrupt in some way and what's going out under your name isn't actually what you think. Trade secrets, giving away business secrets, telling the secret formula for iron brew, for example. Food labeling, saying something that isn't true on food. Non-disclosure agreements, that's a very standard part of legal life now. Information that betrays people's privacy. The right to be forgotten, a new right that the European Union imposed on browsers to remove items that might perpetuate information that after a period of at which a person has a right to have that obscured. So, for example, if you've been a bankrupt, you can appeal to or require Google and other browsers to remove that. And finally, perjury, saying things that are false. and misleading, and may lead to legal processes being derailed. So we've never entirely had free speech, ever. And I think, as I say, there are good reasons to suppose that speech shouldn't be free in the sense you can just say anything you like, when you like, to whom you like. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights brought in some conditions, another instrument of the UN Assembly, but now quite a long while later. And they said the exercise of these rights, sorry about the typo, the exercise of these rights carries special duties and responsibilities. So you can't just speak freely without thinking of the consequences, and may therefore be subject to certain restrictions, and in relation to the kinds of instances that I just talked about, when necessary, for respect to the rights or reputation of others, for the protection of national security, public order, and so on, public health and morals. So they were trying to limit the number of exemptions, but each of those categories is obviously quite a sweeping one. And some people point back to what John Stuart Mill says, that we can speak freely so long as it doesn't harm others. So he thought that we could somehow capture the whole thing by saying there's no right to harm, and the right to spare other people from harm trumps the right to have freedom of speech. Now, of course, all of these are more or less in the right direction, and one might say, why do we need to debate it any more than that? Well, the reason, of course, is that individuals are making decisions about what they consider to be appropriate in terms of their speech and language and writing, and that's affecting other people who are vulnerable, because the freedom of information means that if you say something in the United States and disseminate it throughout the world, you can cause harm, as we all know, to individuals anywhere. So I'm going to look at two instances, as I said before, of where freedom of speech is now generally regarded as being harmful and dangerous, and consider or open a discussion really about whether or not we can actually do anything about it, whether restriction is an appropriate measure, whether there's some way for individuals to protect themselves, or whether we just rely on Facebook developing better and better engines to pick up inappropriate language and kick messages into touch. And the context of that is that being trolled or being bullied online can cause intense emotional reactions. It causes shame in some people because they feel that they should be able to protect themselves against these attacks, and they feel they can't. And that's true too of being bullied at school. A lot of people conceal the fact that a lot of young people conceal the fact they're being bullied because they feel ashamed that they're not able somehow to protect themselves, and that other people will consider their vulnerability to be further reason to be bullied. Then people are just very frightened sometimes. The language that's being used is quite often violent, and people feel just an instinctive reaction of fear. Sometimes people think that they will be actually physically stalked, but that's not necessary to feel that same sense in which you're being invaded, you're not safe anymore, and that can invoke, of course, a lot of very primitive fears in any of us. And if that process goes on for long enough, or happens in multiple times, as we all know, people become hopeless. And in that context, people may either withdraw, and there's some research in universities that new students in the university do end up cutting themselves off from social media because of bullying, and as a result become very socially isolated, because bullying is a way of meeting new people very often and and it lays the groundwork for actual relationships face to face, or people may start to feel suicidal. And one of the most tragic outcomes, as we know, is that people, young people especially, have killed themselves in response to being bullied, often saying something like, I know I'm a bad person. So they, to use the jargon, internalize what other people think of them. The other particular difficulty about trolling or online bullying is it's extremely hard to defend yourself. People try different ways. They sometimes think that they can counterattack or shame the troll, or in some way turn tables on them. But actually, that very often doesn't work, because trolls are willing to go the extra mile, to say the extra unpleasant thing, to make the extra completely outrageous threat. And people who aren't wanting to be trolls feel too saddened or too uncomfortable about expressing such extreme views themselves that it doesn't work. And of course, the other way of dealing with it is that people simply cut themselves off from contact. Now, so many people use social media for contact. And in the whole Brexit debate, it seems to me extremely important that people feel that there is solidarity, and in the face of a letter from the Home Office, feel there's some group you can talk to about it, get some reference group, and more often than not, maybe get some expert advice about how to deal with it. So trolls and bullies online have potential to cause very considerable harm. Trolling is generally anonymous, which it makes it even more difficult to deal with. Even if you can suspect that you know who is doing it, it's hard to be absolutely sure. People may be using false email addresses, or may create email addresses just for the purpose of trolling. And they may be hundreds, thousands of miles away. So there's no real way of getting a grip on the situation. If your bully is in your school, well, there's a chance of dealing with it. Or sometimes if you feel very isolated and you can't talk about it, it may seem as if it's no good that you know who it is. But if you're just trolled by somebody randomly, if you're just picked out to be attacked, then it's even harder to deal with, and you may feel completely stifled. And of course, impotence in this situation is one of the things that leads to depression and, as I say, withdrawal. The other thing that trolls seem to me, I'm not sure there's been enough research really that motivates, helps us to understand what motivates trolling. But one of the things it seems to be driven by are people who want to silence an opponent. And often the opponent isn't somebody who just has an opinion, it's somebody who is actually a kind of, not really an opponent at all, but somebody that is made into an opponent by virtue of their gender or their ethnicity, something completely completely distinct from that person's opinions. But what they want to do, sometimes, trolls, seems to be just to make that person silent, unable to participate. So, unlike domestic violence, which also sometimes seems to be driven by the wish to suppress what your spouse wants to say or really thinks about you, it can be almost impossible for the victimized person to deal with, because they fear that any speaking up that they do will be silenced by even more extreme measures. But there's another funny aspect to trolling that I really don't understand, which is that it involves sometimes trickery, giving people knowingly false advice, being pleased to tell people how not to mend their computers and have the computer disks crash, giving people deliberate misinformation and wasting their time. And that, I think, must be about trying to create a sense of being dominant over other people. But it also involves ridiculing other people, and this might be something that the troll shares with their trolling group. Haven't I been clever? Haven't I been successful? And so there's an element of humiliation in that, which of course then very easily leads to the person who's being victimized feeling ashamed. I've talked about threats or violent language. As we all know, some of that language can be so utterly violent as to be repugnant. And yet I think the troll somehow feels that that language is justified or is in some way acceptable. Trolls, I guess, are typically loners, although now we're discovering that more and more trolls are being organized, perhaps deliberately so, in order to silence debate politically. But I think once you've been trolled, then other trolls come along or somehow see that there's an opportunity for you to be trolled even more by them. And that in itself seems to be satisfying to the people who do it. Bullies I've already talked about, and especially offline bullies who are face-to-face. There's somebody you can identify. Bullies are known to be likely to have been bullied themselves, so one of the things they bully for is probably to gain social acceptance. And the other thing about bullies, and I think it's probably fundamental for all of us, is that primate groups have maintained themselves, do maintain themselves by casting out undesirable others. So if it's a group of temple langurs in India, the young males, once they become sexually active, are thrown out by the dominant male. So it's something we've inherited, this othering thing, and we actually create our own group sometimes simply by othering other people and chucking them out and humiliating them or stamping on them psychologically. So bullies sometimes work together in order to create their own social solidarity when they're not really sure of their own social standing. And maybe, I suppose, trolls do. If you went on to 4chan, I suppose, and looked at some of the more obscure places, you'd probably find trolling groups where people boast about their trolling experiences.
Thank you. I mean, that was a really nice presentation, and put in a very sort of calm way, and I think that's really, really interesting. You're talking about trolling and bullying. There, I suppose, several questions about that. One is how we can deal with it, and we'll come to that. And you talked to some extent about why people troll and bully. But we've got someone on here today who's typing up quite a lot of things. Paul, alias John Smith, who says that trolling is not just about individuals doing it for all the ego reasons that they might want to do it in the way that you described, but powerful organizations do it to target people. Governments do it to target people. They actually employ, I mean, there's been all the fuss about Russians trolling for elections and so on and putting fake news out, but all governments do it. They troll in order to target individuals, to discredit them and to discredit ideas. How do you respond to that? Have you had any experience of that?
I haven't personally had any experience, no. And obviously, most of my work is with individuals and working with the relationships of individuals at a human level, not at a political level. I quite agree with Paul or John that there seems to be growing evidence of organized trolling. I wonder though, I mean, clearly that's a means to humiliate people, but, it's a bit more like what we always thought the Russians did when they got people into compromising situations, wasn't it? And they got people to, found them in bed with somebody and then they took pictures of and so on. It's fun, it's curiously detached in a way. It's extremely unpleasant, of course, for the person being trolled, but the trolls themselves are a bit like violent criminals who use menaces to get some kind of instrumental goal. I think in a way, to me, that's a bit less disturbing than somebody who actually uses violence because violence is somehow appealing, who somehow trolls because that fulfills some kind of individual or need on their own part. But then, you know, as I said, I haven't actually experienced being trolled personally by a group or an organization. I can understand that must feel extremely unpleasant.
I suppose, in a way, if you have laws to prevent trolling and bullying of individuals, and individuals who do it, you're in a way given access to governments and powerful organisations to do it, because you won't be able to access them so easily. So this is really, you know, right in the question of free speech versus abuse. How do you have regulation on the internet to prevent abuse and bullying that is an equal playing field, that stops governments being able to do it when individuals can't?
Yeah. Well, I guess there's one, I mean, I don't know the answer to that because none of us know the answer at the moment, do we? But I suppose there's one part of it's a bit like spam, isn't it? That there are ways of intercepting where a message originates from, and if it originates for some kind of IP address that you know is in Kazakhstan and is unlikely to have any personal meaning to the individual being trolled, then that might raise some suspicion. There are obviously ways of intercepting particular words or particular aspects of a message, I imagine. But I suppose the other thing is that we're probably going to have to accept very reluctantly that the freedom of speech on the internet will no longer be just an untrammeled freedom that can have no regulation. There are already terrorist sites that are being intercepted, sites of neo-Nazis that are being intercepted, as well as, of course, of pornography and pedophile sites and so on. I think we just have to probably live with the fact that speech won't be quite as free. And, sometimes the things that evoke, I know that in the Brexit debate, people have said things on the internet or posted caricatures of political figures that, to my mind, are unacceptable. Even though there might be people who are sympathetic to my view that we should have voted to remain, and we must try and remain if there's anything individuals can do about it. But even so, the measures that some people have taken to try and get that message across have offended me. So I think we have to accept that this is going to cut across all of us. None of us can be simply able to say what we want.
So there was a question about, do you know anything about people management software?
I don't recognize the term. I'm not sure what you're referring to, but perhaps I will recognize it when you explain. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Person management software.
I think that, there's been this debate about Cambridge Analytics.
Okay.
Use algorithms to actually go in and make people change their opinion by targeting specific people.
Sure.
And sending messages out, which is part of this debate really as well.
Well, yeah, of course I know about that. I think that there is Cambridge Analytica has been made into a bit of a bogey, hasn't it? None of us really believe that we're influenced by advertising, however carefully it's targeted at our particular demographic. I'm sure we're more susceptible to advertising, but I'm not sure we're quite as susceptible as people imagine Cambridge Analytica has made us. But I think that's just going to be a fact of our life, isn't it? That people will target all sorts of things at us by better and better use of deep, data mining. So Tesco's send me vouchers and make me offers, which I know are based on my shopping history. And that's going to happen more and more, whether, as long as I suppose as people are not capturing data that is rightly private, maybe we just need to live with that. And maybe we need to be much more careful about how we use likes and so on Facebook, in the knowledge that people are going to be using those preferences to do that. I mean, I think that, we imagine that Facebook and Twitter and so on are private spaces, but they're not, are they? They're very public spaces.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I suppose, given your own background, Digby, you are looking at the effects that bullying and trolling can have on individuals. Whereas I guess some people are asking questions about state interference, which in a way is a different question. And I think maybe we should do a webinar on that. Because that's not your experience. You don't know whether state is involved or not. And in a way, I think what you're talking about is the impact that trolling and bullying has on individuals, on their mental health, on their sense of worth, and so on. And in your experience, the internet is something that you have found have really adversely affected individuals?
Sure. I think that current research suggests that impact is perhaps less than was believed, but clearly there have been terrible individual cases which have achieved a lot of publicity, rightly so, where an individual young person especially has been driven to very extreme measures by being targeted or trolled. But just coming back to your point for us, I mean, I know that I'm not an expert on Cambridge Analytica and these sorts of things, and so I don't want to put forward an expert view, but are we really sure of the impact of these things? In a way, it's a bit, to me, it's a bit like the sorts of things that people say about how governments work and how we're secretly being tracked by the FBI, or in our case MI5, or there is, it seems to me to we wouldn't think that we would have such power over people if we had these kinds of tools available, because we're only too aware that there's many a slip between cup and lip. So I really find it hard to imagine actually that however many thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars were given Cambridge Analytica, they had that much of an impact, or indeed how much of an impact that Putin's stooges have. I think this is just an open question, of course.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's another debate, and it's a huge debate, because I think people who look at what's called social physics obviously do think that in the age of big data, you can have that impact. But someone who calls himself obscure splurge, is it? Yeah. I mean, is saying about free speech that in a way, free speech is sort of culturally defined. You may create offense to someone for saying something that someone else in another culture would not find offensive. So you're limiting free speech in one to a person dealing with one culture, but that's open in another culture. Now, how do you get an equal playing field in those circumstances?
Well, I mean, anybody who lives in London has had to come to terms with the very many different cultures, clothing styles, dietary habits, religious observances, language, family structures of many different cultures, and people who cope better or worse with that, to that. But so in a way, what I think we're talking about is a globalized society in which every culture potentially is one in which we have to have some degree of cultural competence and be aware of how what we say is going to be received by somebody else in a very different situation. But that's just, I mean, that's how it is, isn't it? That's how life is. You know, you wouldn't dream of walking into a room of people you didn't know and just saying the first thing that came into your head, unless you knew something about those people as an experience and their life up to that point. So I don't think that that's something that is qualitatively different. We just need to show a great deal more sensitivity to avoid being seen as victimizers in some way.
I think that people kind of talking about we are being controlled by the government or by some agencies trying to control us, the filter what it is we are allowed to put on YouTube and Google and Facebook or wherever we want to put. My question is that who would do it? You know, why there are so many people, billion of people putting things on YouTube all the time? Who would have time to do it, and who would be interested in doing it? You know, for what favor? Or do we have a machine to do it, to filter from what we want to see and what we don't want to see?
Well, I think that's a very good point, but you know, there other people have had to deal with these problems in a smaller scale. Newspapers had to consider whether or not, when they printed something that somebody said, they were printing defamatory information or they were maintaining a slander, accessory to a slander, or in this case, a libel. So I think, you know, that problem is massive in scale. I absolutely agree, but it still seems to me to be a responsibility of the particular medium of communication concerned, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or whoever, to introduce measures to ensure that some basic principles are met. Now, we know that Twitter has a team of people who look at messages and remove, well, certainly paedophile messages. We know that YouTube have people who screen out scenes of horror or violence. It must be horrible work for them. So people are already accepting responsibility, and I think that responsibility is going to have to be extended. But I think we also need to take some responsibility ourselves, that if we, you know, like just coming back to the Brexit thing, I've seen caricatures that show, you know, people in humiliating situations that are made up in Photoshop. And if we do that to people and our friends and sympathizers say, oh, that's great, then I think we have to expect similar ad hominem treatment from our opponents. So I think we in the end, the users of that medium, create the culture.
Perry Walker raised an interesting point as well. He talks about, you know, a balancing act in the right to be forgotten. He talks about an artist who wanted his material that he'd done 5 years ago to be deleted because his work had moved on. Now, should an artist have the right to be forgotten in that sense, or because he's an artist, should we be able to see his work of 5 years ago? Should he have the right to delete?
Right. Well, if it were still your property, in as much as you'd exhibited an image but still retain the original, then I guess I wouldn't have any difficulty about saying to somebody they have a right to have that removed. In some ways, you know, the issue I think about bankruptcy is harder, isn't it? If you have been bankrupt and you have that removed from the web, and then you're soliciting investors in a new company, you might argue that in some way you're doing that under false pretenses, so that shouldn't be removed. But an artist, why not? You know, we have an artist has the right to burn their paintings or their unfinished novel, or, you know, so it's their property. It's when you actually sell it, I suppose, that the difficulty comes, because then there are property rights. But I think what we're talking about is how all of these things do need to be debated. There's no cut and dried principle, is there? We're debating a conflict between different rights. The very heart of this is that freedom of speech is very important. It's absolutely crucial that we can draw the attention of our governments, for example, to iniquities, to bad behavior. We can tell them, we can out people who've been taking bribes and so on. It's absolutely crucial. So I'm not suggesting at all that free speech it's fine just to go against it or trample it. It's very important to protect it. In that sense, having a Russian blog industry or a Russian troll agency trying to suppress political comment in the UK is actually like going against free speech. But I just don't think that free speech is just like that. The freedom of to roam. Well, that's very important. But does that mean you walk down the M1 if you so fancy? Well, no, obviously not. So no freedom, no right is without some kind of condition.
Perry actually sort of clarified what this artist was doing. And it's really interesting because there's conflict here. He's talking about the right to be forgotten, but what he was asking was that the articles written about his previous work be deleted. So he was using his right to be forgotten to deny the freedom of others' speech.
Well, that's difficult, isn't it? Because if you write about an artist, you might have put some of your own ideas, some of your own intellectual property in that. And to have that taken away is a violation of your rights, I suppose. So yeah, that's tricky. Without really thinking too clearly about it, and Perry might well be able to have a view himself or herself, I would say that you don't have a right, an artist wouldn't have a right to take down what somebody else has written or some other person's contribution has been, even though they might have identified you as being an artist and you don't want to be so identified. But, it's an interesting case.
It is like we are a little bit conflicting. We are saying that Google allow, and then those social media allowed us to put things in and don't stop, a lot of things. And at the same time, people are also talking about that they are not very happy that Google are moving things away.
Mm-hmm.
And it is again, and we come back again to the balance: what is right, what is wrong, and where to stop and where to start. But it is, I can't see any evidence, any proof that they do it because of political reasons or just because they feel that's the right thing to do for themselves.
I think Peter put that point very clearly, Digby, when he was saying that Google and Facebook, so on, say they're publishers, but they refuse to take responsibility for what they publish increasingly. Yeah. And, so it's not a question of trolling and bullying by individuals. The agencies like Facebook and Google have a big responsibility here.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I shared with you my own personal experience, Francis, which is that every time I publish a book, a certain person knows somehow I published and goes on Amazon, gives it a 1-star or 0-star rating, and then comments on my professional ability in an extremely disparaging way. Now, obviously, it doesn't do the sales of the book much good to see that my review starts with 1 star. And it doesn't make me feel very good to read these disparaging comments, which incidentally are by somebody whom actually I'm not even sure I've had personal contact with, but that's another thing. But every time I've gone to Facebook or the publisher has gone to Facebook to say, this review has nothing to do with the book, it's just a comment about this person, an ad hominem comment, they've said, oh, no, this is free speech. And we refuse to do anything about it. And in this situation, I feel completely impotent and harmed and unfairly treated. But I've come to see there's nothing I can do about it. And in a way, if you had to generalize, Kant's idea, can you generalize from your individual circumstances to the whole community. If actually I was able to say, no, this must be taken down, and then everybody could do that, I would think that was a harm, basically, overall. So personally, it harms me. But in terms of what it means for the whole community, I think it's a strength that they don't accept what I'm saying and take it down.
Okay,
I have one question.
Can I just say before you do that, Fon, a couple of people have put in corrections to what we said. Perry is saying it's not the comments of about the artist that was deleted; it was the links, so no one could find them on the internet. They became anonymous.
Oh, okay.
And Peter is saying Facebook didn't say they're not publishers, not that they are, in order to avoid their responsibility. So that's my mistake. I got it wrong.
They asked about what is your book about?
Oh, well, I've written 14. So this next one, they're mainly, the most recent ones have been about autism. But the next one is about the interbrain. And I'm fully expecting when it comes out in January to see my, the familiar first review being 1 star and the same comments about me being a terrible person and a terrible doctor that I've had for every book I've published for the last...
So you have done 14 books, and the first 1 star in the beginning and then 5 stars at the end?
Might get 5 stars from somebody else, but never 5 stars from this particular person who always uses the same initials, so I know who it is. Well, I recognize that it's that person. I never get more than 1 star from them.
I mean, in your presentation, you raised the big liberal philosopher of social liberalism, John Stuart Mill, who obviously argued that we should all be free as long as we don't harm someone else in the use of our freedom. Now, how do you translate that to the internet age? That becomes really difficult, doesn't it? It's an easy philosophy to understand, and it's been the source of liberalism now for 150 years plus. But in the age of the internet, it needs updating somehow, doesn't it?
Well, I think you're right in that he said, after all, at the end, the honest opinion will triumph over the dishonest one. So we can safely leave it to being a kind of self-regulating system. But I do agree with what everybody said so far. It's not working well, that self-regulation, that there are pockets in the internet, perhaps larger and larger pockets, where there is dictatorship and fascism. I don't know if that's the right word, but there are dominant voices who are suppressing others' freedom, and those dominant voices are often repugnant or damaging. So I don't think John Stuart Mill living now, where would have been able to assume that basically there's a common standard of decency that would be upheld everywhere. But there are enough people who are suppressing other people's voices one way or another for whatever reason, whether they're orchestrated or solo, that, there needs to be some imposition of some kind of... I mean, I hate to say this because I've always thought the wonderful thing about the internet was it was free. And I love to, read different people's opinions and get a sense of the whole variety of human experience and human, thinking about things. It's quite striking. But clearly there are bits of the internet that have been colonized now by people who are malicious in some way. And I'm not sure that it's going to work out that the majority are going to be able to overcome that without some kind of external control. I mean, after all, we're not great as human beings at defeating dictatorships. We often fall under the influence of a very powerful dictator and suffer as communities as a result. And I think the internet's going to be the same.
You are saying, are you, that you cannot envisage an open system where anyone can say anything they want?
I don't think there ever has been an open system like that. There have always been laws that have regulated opinion. The difficulty has been, of course, enforcing those laws where people can make their opinions anonymously. But there's no area of human interaction where you can simply say what you want and there's no consequences.
You see, I mean, what some people are saying on here, and I think what they're getting sort of uptight about a bit, is that if you stop freedom of speech for the individual because they're trolling or they're bullying or whatever, then you're just opening, you know, that up to Google and Facebook to do it themselves, and for government agencies and whatever to do it. And you're not giving the individual the right to respond. You're shutting them down, and therefore you're creating an unequal system. I mean, can you respond to that in any way, or can you see a way around that?
Well, I don't think the situation is any different from newspapers. So we're not asking the Daily Mail to regulate itself independently of what anybody else thinks. We're saying to them, look, you're answerable to the Press Commission and the law, and you've got to take that into account. And that the law and the Press Commission hopefully represent an independent interest and monitor. So I'm not saying that we should leave Facebook just to regulate itself or Google to regulate itself. And of course, people can, the fact that the Daily Mail does publish things that offend people and doesn't get sued by or taken to task by the Press Commission means that there's lively debate about what it prints or any other newspaper. So that's pretty much what I think about the internet. But there are obviously extremes which I think we just need to, and all of us would agree, surely, if you publish something saying let's all meet up and have a riot and kill as many people as possible of this particular ethnicity, none of us would say that's acceptable.
See, I think what people are saying, and someone said it on here, is that Socrates was killed for his opinions.
Socrates' case is a bit complicated. He wasn't somebody that the Athenians thought took his responsibilities sufficiently seriously in terms of playing his part in government, as he was required to do. And lots of people have pointed out that without really very much concessions to the authorities, he could have avoided the hemlock altogether. And so these things aren't quite straightforward. But of course, people, I don't know, what are we saying? That because there are martyrs, because we make terrible mistakes, sometimes because people are treated unfairly, sometimes even leading to their judicial execution or whatever, we shouldn't have any kind of policing, any kind of control over what people say. I think, none of these extreme positions are going to work. Neither complete government control in Iran style, or as I understand it, or the Chinese situation as I read about it. I don't know how it really happens, or complete laissez-faire or libertarianism. None of these are formulae are actually going to meet the need. We're going to need to address specific instances and find structures that do that fairly.
Okay.
Francis, there is a question about David Kelly. Can I do it quickly?
Very quickly.
The question is that do you think that he committed suicide?
I think that the question is that there was fake news put out about that by the government, and it was used by the media.
I agree, but is that about the internet itself, or is it about free speech, or is it about? I mean, does that touch directly on our discussion? I'm not sure.
Well, I suppose it touches on our discussion in the sense that the internet is used to hide what government does, to give other reasons for people's death, to perpetuate fake news. And the whole idea of bullying and trolling has got to be also combined with fake news as well, because those are all misuses of the internet in an age of globalization, of global information. So in that sense, I think what people are saying is that they don't trust institutions to be fair, and they feel that they need to fight back somehow by having their freedom of speech to do so. The problem, as you put it, is that that freedom of speech can hurt others, and you're a therapist and you've seen that happen. So how do you square that circle?
Well, it seems to me that what people are saying is it's not okay for that party to speak freely, but it's okay for us. And who is to know that they're actually representing exactly what did happen, or, you know, there will be a multitude of voices, and perhaps it's wrong for people to invest a lot of money so that the best, noisiest people get to dominate the discussion. I rather agree with that. But, you know, I think you have to have a regulation or a procedure that, you know, runs across all parties. So if you want to be able to say what you think, and be able to express your opinion freely, then it seems only right that everybody else can. But if you accept that they must in some way be circumscribed or limited, then I think you have to accept that you must be too in some way.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our hour now, so we'll leave it there. So thank you very much, Digby, for that presentation. Thank you for all the points that came up. We haven't been able to cover them all because they came through fast and furious. We tried to cover as many as we can. Some of the more deeper questions about state involvement, I think, needs another webinar where we concentrate on that alone.
Yeah.
And I think we probably need to do something more with you about the effect on people personally, and your work with autistic children, for example, is quite interesting in terms of the effect it has on them. So, you know, we've covered a wide area really, and it really needs sometimes to be focused down. So thank you for doing that, and I think that's been really worthwhile.